Day 35. Saint Anne-de-Mont to Bathurst. Today was going to be another day of both sadness and excitement. The same sadness and excitement I felt when leaving a lot of the awesome cities and regions I have been to throughout this trip. I felt sad as I was leaving Quebec, the Gaspé Peninsula, for another adventure, and the memories that I've created here. However, I did feel excited to return to New Brunswick, a province I have lived in briefly as a child, and for once in decades, I'd be setting foot in the Maritimes, the place that I call home. I woke up and started my daily routine. After preparing myself, I said a brief goodbye to Saint Anne-de-Mont, and like I did with all other awesome places throughout my trip, I vowed to return in the future. I took this scenic drive once more, this time past Parc National Forlon, up to Gaspé. Little did I know that this was the birthplace of Canada. It was another beautiful day, another beautiful drive, and the weather was hot. Hot but not humid, so it was tolerable. With the breeze off the Atlantic Ocean cooling me off, I was able to explore Gaspé in comfort. There were a number of exhibitions here at the birthplace of Canada, showcasing the history of Canada and more specifically, naturally, the Francophone history of this region. I found a legend that indicated the area should be explored by numerical order, as there was a sequence to this exhibit, but I remained on the main section as I didn't want to backtrack to the other areas. It was still surprisingly busy here, but I enjoyed seeing other people as the entire country was still under heavy restrictions. The exhibit had heritage-looking buildings reminiscent of Atlantic Canada, squared off with low overhang roofs made of cedar and plain wood siding. A number of the exhibits were closed, but I enjoyed looking at the ones that were open. It was also great to see some exhibits that commemorated the First Nations of the region as well, something I thought was lacking in many areas of the places I've visited so far. Shipping and trade were a major part of the history of this region, and that was shown throughout the exhibit. History of the original French settlement in this area is also widely celebrated, as this would be a significant area of Francophone pride. I stood in the face of the sun, looking out by the water and basking in the ocean breeze that came over me. How many people ever get to do what I was doing? Traveling across Canada on a spontaneous adventure is a once-in-a-lifetime adventure, and I was so thankful to be able to accomplish this. But my adventure was not coming to an end. There was still a lot of area to cover, so I headed back to my beast to continue onward. I took the scenic drive to Percé, hugging the coastline, enjoying the views of the water. As I approached, I could see the famous Percé Rock and l'Obélisque in the distance. This was the landmark of the Gaspé Peninsula, the most photographed backdrop in this region. I quickly parked my beast and headed down to the pier to take a closer look. The town of Percé was much busier than any other place on the Gaspé Peninsula that I had visited previously. It was surprisingly busy, and I could have imagined how much busier it would be were it not for the restrictions across Canada during the time. The weather was beautiful, quite windy off the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The backdrop of Percé was just absolutely stunning. Cliffs rose above the water, where several homes stood atop in the face of the Atlantic. The waters looked calm, at least for now, but the wind would easily sweep up and show the power of nature that nature possessed. Percé Rock and l'Obélisque looked so close I knew that if I had a kayak, I could have easily kayaked over to explore further, although ocean kayaking was not the same as lake kayaking. In the distance, there appeared to be a few sea caves along the bottom of the cliffs. Unfortunately, I would not be able to explore those either. There were a number of tour boats along the pier, offering tours of the surrounding waters, but I knew that would have to be something I would entertain myself with in the future. There were also a number of adventure parks close by, but due to the restrictions, they were closed. Perhaps in the future, when I return for a whale watching adventure, I would also entertain myself in the adventure park. Since I was finally at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, actually now at the Gulf of St. Lawrence, I had to have a traditional Atlantic Canadian lunch, so I stopped by for halibut and chips at a local eatery. It was quite expensive, as I expected, but it was every bit as delicious as I expected it to be. Up on a cliff, there was a cliffside walk that led to an observation point overlooking the entire town of Percé, as well as Percé Rock and L'Obélisque. I began the uphill walk over to the observation point. I gained elevation, and I would look back at Percé, imagining what life would be like living in one of these small towns in the Gaspé Peninsula. Economically, these towns were dying, with perhaps only Gaspé and Percé which had somewhat a sustainable future due to tourism. But there was a beauty in living within a small, close-knit Atlantic Francophone community that could not be replicated anywhere else in Canada. I drew closer to the entrance of the cliffside walk. I passed through the manicured lawns where families were enjoying the summer with picnics. I did manage to see a few kayakers and stand-up paddleboarders enjoying the sunny but windy day on the water. While some of these homes atop the cliffs were perfectly restored, others had signs of accelerated aging. I could imagine the windswept mist from the Atlantic would degrade the exterior of these homes much quicker than the homes further inland. But these properties and the location would be arguably worth the extra maintenance. I began the cliffside walk to the observation point, following a small group of people also heading to the top. I would look back again numerous times at Percé as I gained more elevation before reaching the end. Percé Rock and L'Obélisque seemed so close that I could almost reach out and touch it. Atop the observation point, I struck up a conversation with a man and his daughter, who were on an adventure similar to mine. It was interesting how he lived in Toronto, a city that I was just visiting a few weeks ago. I told him how I loved Toronto and I found it much friendlier and much more exciting than in Vancouver. He also mentioned how he previously lived in St. Boniface, the Francophone area of Winnipeg. I mentioned how I lived in Winnipeg for many years as well. We continued with some interesting dialogue for some time before I bid farewell and continued onward with my adventure. I felt a little bit of sadness, again leaving another wonderful place in Quebec as I ventured into Atlantic Canada. After saying goodbye and kissing the sky above Gaspé, I drove along the coast, passing through numerous small villages on the southern end of the Gaspé Peninsula. As I drew closer to New Brunswick, I noticed the number of Acadian flags and monuments showing up. I felt like I was coming back home after being away for so long. I crossed over the J.C. Van Horn Bridge separating Quebec from New Brunswick, where I finally set foot in Atlantic Canada. The sun was starting to set by now, and I still had a long drive to Bathurst. But it was a wonderful feeling being back home, being back in my home, Atlantic Canada. I lived in New Brunswick as a child, although I officially call Nova Scotia my true home. New Brunswick holds so many wonderful childhood memories for me, as it was great to be back. After walking the base of the J.C. Van Horn Bridge and taking pictures of my surroundings, I drove further into Bathurst, where I would settle for the evening. My adventures in Quebec, which last longer than any province so far, were truly an adventure in itself. From the crazy characters I met in Montreal, to the history I experienced in Quebec City, to the pristine nature of the Gaspé Peninsula, I lived every bit of my experience in Quebec. I would never, ever forget this for the remainder of my life. I settled in my beast for the evening, pondering on what adventures lie in wait for me tomorrow. Subscribe to the Travel Experience de Voyage channel. Tap the bell and join the conversation on the comment section below.